Hi, welcome to day 9 of the Easter tree. Today we're going to study Jacob wrestling with God. Here we find Jacob is fearing the worst. He is having a guilty conscience, getting ready to face his brother Esau again, hoping to reconcile, but he's not sure. So here he is desiring to please and impress his brother with these gifts, planning and praying and planning and praying. He plans in verse 7 through 8, prays in verses 9 through 12, plans again in 13 through 21, praying in verses 22 through 32, making plans again in Genesis 33, 1 through 3. He is setting up a defense measure. He is praying, and this time very sincerely. He's also making movements towards a mutual agreement with his brother. Scripture approves of this kind of strategy when it is a tool for reconciliation rather than a substitute for God. Some examples of that are Joshua chapter 8, 4 through 12, and Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 9. Remember, when Jacob left his house, all he had was himself and a staff. Now you see him coming back a completely wealthy man. If you owned 30 camels, you were extremely rich. I'm sure the gifts that he was giving Esau were not even all of the treasure and the wealth that he had. It was just part of it. Here you see the fruit of what God has done and God keeping his covenant promise. And here we see Jacob's first recorded prayer. And this prayer really shows that he is sincere. When Jacob says, "I'm not worthy," you see a spiritual transformation that's taken place inside of him. His prayer is different. He's submitting to Esau and he's recognizing that he is completely unworthy before God. When he talks about steadfast love and faithfulness, you see him describing God's loyalty to his covenant promise. Jacob now identifies himself fully with the covenant promises that God gave to Abraham and Isaac, and his faith rests firmly in God's covenant promise to him as well. I think that's a good question that he puts there when he says, "To whom do you belong and where are you going?" Those are excellent questions to maybe be journaling about. Those are two good questions to ponder in life. Did you notice verse 24? Jacob was left alone. I think so many times in our culture we try not to be left alone. We're afraid of being alone. I often find that when you're alone, you really have to sit with yourself. You can be transparent and honest before God. So let's not avoid having those times of being alone. This great encounter with God happened when Jacob was struggling, and Jacob knew himself to be exposed to a situation that he had no control over. He felt conflict, and it brought to a head the battling and the groping that he's been doing his whole life, looking for approval and blessing. Don't you love the way God met him? Don't you love the way God lets you literally wrestle and struggle through with him? He's enabling Jacob to actually win. He does that with us as well. He enables us and empowers us to struggle with it. God is enabling and allowing Jacob to actually win, even as he's wrestling and struggling with God. Don't you love that about him? That he does welcome the struggle. He wants you to wrestle with him. He even touches Jacob's hip and it's put out of joint as he's wrestling with him. And it's so interesting because for a wrestler, your hip is the pivot point. It's so important in the process of struggling and wrestling, but how God breaks it sometimes so that you can completely fall into him. There was a time in my life when I was a senior in high school and my father passed away suddenly. Then a couple months later, I was in a car accident and my kneecap and my leg was completely broken. Doctors even said that they weren't even sure if I was going to be able to ever walk again. Well, that was a time when God took me and he exposed the things that I was putting my identity in. Who I was in my standing with my father. I was definitely a daddy's girl. If I ever had a problem, I would go straight to my dad and I'd ask my dad before I'd consult and pray to God. I grew up in the church, so I definitely had an affection for God, but he was not my go-to man. My dad was. Also, my identity lied heavily in my own capabilities and my own physical strength. I was very active in sports and in various athletic and recreational activities that depended on my physical health and my ability to jump and run and dance and perform. However, God knew that those things were not going to give me life and that those things were actually going to hinder my relationship with him because it enabled my self-sufficiency, not my God dependency, and my realization that I needed to be sufficiently depending on God and that he indeed is sufficient. although that's not what I would have chosen. I wish that I had known better so it wouldn't have been such a harsh experience for me. But often it's through those harsh times. It's not a slow rip of the Band-Aid, but a complete ripping it off experience that wakes you up, sobers you up, and makes you ask hard questions like he was asking here. To whom do you belong and where are you going? Take heart. Here we see that the crippling and the maiming show that God's ends were still the same. God wanted to have all of Jacob and all of Jacob's will to win, to attain and obtain. He wanted to purge Jacob's self-sufficiency and redirect him to the proper object of his love. That should not be Jacob himself or any other affections that are worldly, but that his affections needed to be pointed straight towards God. So after the maiming, Jacob being completely transformed to utter dependence, Jacob emerges broken and he's even named and he's blessed. It was defeat and victory all in one. What's awesome about Jacob is that Jacob is supremely interested in gaining blessing no matter what the cost. That has always been his personality. He's all in. I also love the juxtaposition of the person he's wrestling, God himself, who had to have been of supernatural power in order to dislocate someone's hip with one touch. That would be God. You see this in Jacob when he says in verse 26, I will not let you go until you bless me. I think that tenacity and that perseverance, that's something to be admired and to actually adopt for ourselves. What would that look like if you had that attitude, if you had that spirit of God, I am with you, I'm not letting you go until you bless me. And I wish that we would be more that way, to really know God, to connect with him and be completely giving of ourselves to him and asking him to help us to surrender. Because here we are, we have our idols and God just having him pry open our fingers, no matter what it takes. Bless me, God, bless me. And what comes out of that? He gets a new name, gets a new standing, changing his character and his outcome. In verse 30, you see Jacob worshiping, saying, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. Face to face. What's so interesting too is that what is the purpose of a face, really? In verse 30, when Jacob says, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. It's so interesting because the face is not a vital organ that's necessary for survival. Yet God reveals his face to Jacob. He's so personal, isn't he? God is so personal. It's the most transparent place where it's a window into your heart. When you read the Bible and people say, oh, well, the God of the Old Testament is not personal, you can point to this passage that God does get personal. He loves us. What's beautiful in chapter 33 is that you get a beautiful picture of reconciliation. In verse 4, but Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Can't you just imagine this picture? I mean, if this were a movie, this would be the part where everybody's eyes are sniffling is happening in the audience. Because we love reconciliation. It's such a beautiful picture of sinners coming together, enabled by God, to have that kind of forgiveness and just coming back together. The meeting is a classic picture of reconciliation. All of Jacob's fears have been proven unfounded. God had already been at work in Esau and had also blessed Esau. There was no longer a grudge, that no longer was Esau seeking revenge. Both of them wept. Can you imagine just the brothers embracing and weeping together? And in that culture, it was uncommon to weep. The fact that it's documented they wept, it's such a powerful image, a powerful moment. Doesn't this remind you of the story of the prodigal son? There's another beautiful picture of God talking about reconciliation in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 16 through 21. Christian families are a work in progress. We're a bunch of sinners who've come together in the name of Christ, working out our salvation as we're being sanctified and as holiness is happening in our lives. Acknowledging that we are sinners, we understand the problem, and we know how to solve the problem, and we try to press on. Now, this would be a time where we open up our Easter tree ornament. So today is day 9. Jacob wrestles with God. What will it be? It's pretty cliche. A ladder. I know. It really should be something else, but I didn't know what else to do. It could have been an angel's wing. So yours could be different. I actually took chopsticks and then I glued it together. And like all days, I have a challenge for you to journal, to ponder, to take some time to go a little bit deeper with whatever it is that God might be speaking to you or wanting you to process as we're going through this Easter tree. Here is my Easter tree day 9, and you see the pillar and the oil from yesterday, Jacob's sincere prayer. I feel like there's so much to learn in that prayer as well. And here is the gift that he gave to his brother. Of course, the to-do list. Gotta love those to-do lists. You see where they meet and then where they end up. And for me personally, I really loved what Jacob said, which was, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." That was very moving to me. Of course, here we have the name change from Jacob to Israel. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for day 10.